To discuss this further, we're joined on set by Rochelle Ferguson, our international affairs editor. So, Rochelle, what have they been proposing in these talks in Havana?
Well, look, you touched on it there, Catherine. This arrival, if you will, of the CIA Director John Ratcliffe. Of course, him meeting there with his Cuban counterpart and other top Cuban officials. What's essentially being put on the table by the United States is $100 million in aid. The United States that this is an attempt to ease the effects of the oil blockade put on Cuba by the United States. Marco Rubio, then the top diplomat for the US, saying that last week Cuba had ultimately rejected this proposition. Interesting, because Cuba says they weren't aware of the proposition to begin with. So already the starting block for these talks have been quite complex. Let's remind our viewers that at the beginning of this month, the US ramped up this blockade on Cuba. They imposed fresh sanctions on a number of senior Cuban officials, accusing them of committing human rights abuses. The US saying it wants Cuba, as you mentioned, to make these fundamental changes before it will offer this aid. And interesting to say, and I think we can show you some of these images, that those talks between John Ratcliffe and Cuban intelligence authorities took place a day after some protests on the streets of Havana, with people coming out, burning, rubbish to express the misery that they're facing of these blackouts. So this visit by John Ratcliffe coming at a time where, tensions between the United States and Cuba are particularly high indeed.
Now, we know there's this ongoing fuel crisis. How has that been affecting Cubans?
Well, that's right. Cuban authorities saying on Thursday that ultimately there is no oil fuel, there's no diesel left in the country. This is, of course, having extensive impacts on the way Cubans are able to live their lives on a daily basis. Extensive blackouts there, some nationwide for months. 50 hours is the latest we've heard of from the latest blackout in Cuba. So you can imagine cooking, many Cubans resorting to either charcoal or to cooking with firewood. So, keeping food cool, for example, refrigerators, of course, if there's no electricity, how do people keep food, which, by the way, is a lot higher, than it has been. How do people, keep the food cool? There's an impact on public transport as well. So an absence of public transport, private methods being used, or private buses or so, which is again a lot higher. Waste collection is also a big issue. If there's no vans, buses around, how is waste collected? So we're seeing a build-up of rubbish on the streets of Havana, which, of course, in terms of health, the question of health is also very difficult. Let's talk a little bit about hospitals. Of course, electricity essential to the running of hospitals. It's worth saying that in a lot of Cuban hospitals now, it's only emergency patients that are being seen. Waiting lists have grown a great deal. And of course, those waiting for surgery are having a very long wait indeed. I'll just mention finally, Catherine, schools are forced to close. If you can't provide a hot meal for students, or any type of meal, because you have no electricity, no water, schools then forced to close their door. And government offices, again, suffering from the same misery with these extensive blackouts. So a great impact then on Cubans living daily lives on the island.
As you had mentioned, the U.S. really is keeping the pressure on there. So how is Cuba responding to the U.S. proposals?
Well, let's talk about these discussions between US and Cuban officials. The US, I hope we can bring this up for you, the Cuba rather, saying these talks with the US have made it possible to demonstrate that categorically Cuba doesn't constitute a security threat to the United States. That's a clear message that the Cuban authorities are wanting to send. They also say that they've never supported any hostile activity against the United States on Cuban soil. The president, though, Miguel Diaz-Canel, saying that instead of offering this aid, this $100 million of aid, conditions could be eased a lot faster. They could be used by de-escalating the energy, the economic, the financial blockade measures that have been put into place. They also say it's unclear, this offer of US aid, is it going to be in cash? Will it be in kind assistance? So a lot of questions still to be cleared up. The United States, of course, is, not allowing Cuba to rely on, as they in times gone by when they've relied on Venezuela and Mexico to supply oil to their refinery system. So a great deal still to be worked on with these deteriorating US-Cuba relations.
Rochelle, thank you so much for taking us through this. That's Rochelle Ferguson from our International Affairs Desk.